All right, now Craig and I are going to do something that hopefully you will find fun. Rather than him getting up and giving a long 30-minute speech in which you, struggle in your seat, I thought I'd interview Craig, ask him a number of questions about his book, and then also throw it to the audience if you've got questions as well. So we'd like to keep this as lively and as moving as possible. So please, as we move forward, if you've got something you want to throw up here, please just raise your hand. But let me ask the first 5 or 6 questions. Does that sound good to you, Craig?
Works for me.
Okay. In our archives here, Craig, we have hundreds and hundreds of President Reagan's radio addresses from that 1976 to 1980 time frame. And when I saw he had that many radio addresses, I thought to myself, from the outset, right after the 76 convention, to be on the air that much, and then having read in your book the fact that he was also writing, I think, like a biweekly newspaper column, he was traveling around the country, dozens and dozens and dozens of different speeches he was giving from the convention onward. It would seem to me that what must have happened at the time was campaign staff said, well, we're not letting this go. From the moment you leave the convention, do all these things in order to position yourself to run for the presidency. Was it that purposeful, or was it just more by happenstance?
No, it was not that purposeful. As a matter of fact, is the campaign after 1976 pretty much dissipated. The staff went their own way, with the exception of Peter Hannaford and Mike Deaver, who were managing the political affairs and the commentaries and the syndicated columns of Governor Reagan's. But there was not a grand plan that started after the convention in '76 for him to mount another challenge, a third challenge for the Republican nomination in 1980. Pretty much the campaign was all separated, and a lot of the staff, as a matter of fact, was playing footsie with other candidates, including Howard Baker and George Bush and John Connally and all those others who ended up taking on Ronald Reagan for the 1980 nomination. So, and compounding that was the fact that a lot of the staff from '76 thought that the '76 was Reagan's last shot, and that he would not run again in 1980, that he would in fact be too old to run again in 1980.
Okay. Now, I think around 1978, it seems to me that President Reagan, not even candidate Reagan yet at the time, happened upon an issue that I'm sure he had been watching for years, but it seemed to be like the wedge issue in that time frame that really helped vaunt him back into the national dialogue, and that would be Panama Canal.
Yes.
Right? Was that an extremely important issue for him?
It was, for those old enough to remember, it was an enormously huge issue in this country. It was so huge in this country that President Carter, who was fighting for the Panama Canal treaties, in 1977, he's lobbying the Senate. He's trying to muster grassroots support for the canal treaties. He does something unprecedented for a president of the United States. In a national television address advocating the passage of the treaties, he attacks private citizen Ronald Reagan. He said, there's a man going around this country who says, we built it, we paid for it, it's ours, we're going to keep it, and that's not quite true. Now, just imagine that. The President of the United States is attacking one citizen out of a nation of 240 million people. It's pretty astonishing. CBS News the next day calls Governor Reagan and says, Governor, would you like 30 minutes of airtime to respond to the President of the United States? Reagan thought about it for about 3 seconds and said, you bet. And they put him on national television, and he gave a 30-minute response to Carter's attack and Carter's position on the canal treaties. The issue also brings up, too, the fissures that were going on inside the Republican Party, because at the time, Reagan is trying to mount this national grassroots campaign to oppose the treaties, and he's approached by then RNC chairman Bill Brock. Brock wanted him to sign a direct mail piece for the Republican National Committee to oppose to raise money to oppose the treaties, and Governor Reagan says, sure, I'd love to. He signs a letter. It makes over $1 million for the Republican National Committee, which was a lot of money, still a lot of money, but it was a lot of money in 1977. So now Governor Reagan is putting together a National Truth Squad to travel the country to mount a grassroots campaign to oppose the treaties. And he goes to Brock and he says, Bill, would you mind if I had some of that money that I raised for the Truth Squad, Brock says no. He wouldn't give him one dime. And the reason Brock wouldn't was because he was, of course, he was from Tennessee, former senator from Tennessee. He and Howard Baker were very good friends. Howard Baker was the Senate Minority Leader who still hadn't taken a position on the treaties. Plus, he was very close friends to Gerald Ford, who was, even as an ex-president, was supporting the Panama Canal Treaty. So Reagan was furious with, as you can imagine, with Brock and with the Republican National Committee. And after that, never raised another dime for the RNC until after he took control of the party, after he got the nomination in July of 1980.
So he, if I have my history correct, the Panama Canal Treaty actually passed.
Yes.
So is it fair to say that President Reagan lost the battle but won the war, in the sense that it positioned him from a philosophical standpoint to help coalesce the conservative coalition?
No, absolutely, John. Is that by the time of the passage of the treaties in the Senate in the spring of 1978, the American people who 2 years before had supported the Panama Canal treaties, now all the national polling has the American people vastly opposed to the Panama Canal treaties. Reagan had convinced them, even though you're right, he lost the battle, but he won the war because it coalesced a lot of the conservative movement for his eventual third drive for the nomination in 1980.
Can you talk to us for a minute about Jack Kemp? I was not working on the Hill at the time, but by the time I got to Capitol Hill, his name was already famous. He might have been a young Republican and somewhat of a backbencher, but it was remarkable that some of his ideas, especially on supply-side economics, those he had gotten from Jude Wanniski and Art Laffer, had found their way to Ronald Reagan, and Reagan started espousing them, quite early on. Kemp was truly a very influential figure on Reagan.
Somebody someday is going to have to do a book on how important Jack Kemp was to the conservative movement and the Republican Party. Jack Kemp was, in many ways, he was our Prometheus. He brought fire to Republican kind. He gave us a hopeful economic message, which conservatism and republicanism had never had before. We had always been, the Republicans and conservatives always been kind of the green eye shade, balanced budget, folks, and the Democrats were the party of hope and opportunity. Their economic message was to spread the wealth, or soak the rich or whatever. But we didn't have something that was hopeful. In September of 1976, Kemp has introduced what is called the Jobs Creation Act in the House. Now, he's a backbencher, and anybody can introduce legislation, but he introduces this bill. And it's brought to Reagan's attention of what it is. It's a massive across-the-board personal income tax, 33% across the board for all Americans. Reagan sees not only the political opportunity here, but what it also does economically for what he believes for the country, and he endorses it immediately. And by 1978, less than 2 years later, it is the centerpiece of his economic philosophy to the American people. And tax cuts were very important, too, for Reagan for two reasons. Everybody thinks it was all about stimulating the economy, and that's true. But from Reagan's standpoint, he was developing and honing a message of optimistic conservatism. And part of that had to be a reliance on the self as opposed to a reliance on the state. And so tax cuts were a way to reduce the individual's reliance upon the state and increase their reliance upon themselves. So that was what really attracted Reagan to tax cuts, was that it made the person, to give them more control of their own destiny.
Now, having read your book, it reminded me of just how many Republican candidates saw the weakness of Jimmy Carter and decided, I'm going to get into this. I mean, it seems like almost a dozen. Maybe it was 10. Do you recall how many it was?
That ended up running?
Yeah, that ended up in the Republican primaries.
It ended up with 6, but there were 8 or 10 who looked at it, including former President Gerald Ford.
That's right. So now I know as the race, we went through all the Republican primaries heading into 1980, it ended up towards the end of being a Ronald Reagan versus George Bush. Do you have a view of all the others that were winnowed out of the field? Is there any particular candidate that really should have had more momentum, had they run a better campaign, should have kind of ended up there at the finish line beyond Bush, or was it really Bush had run the best campaign next to Reagan?
I think Bush had